Having car problems? Well, with Rhoda, getting them fixed is as easy as ordering takeout. They'll come pick up your car for free, do any repair or maintenance needed, and return it right to your driveway. They'll even give you a complimentary video inspection of your car so you can see what needs to be done. Perfect for those of us that maybe aren't so car savvy. Book your appointment online at roda.com. And lucky for you, CityCast listeners get a 20% discount on any service for up to $100 off. Just use the code CityCast20.
Today on CityCast DC, DC is in the process of rethinking a part of town called North Capitol Crossroads. And for those of you who think urban planning is just about big shot planners coming in and dictating what your neighborhood's going to look like, think again. My CityCast colleague, Bridget Todd, has been working with the Office of Planning on a podcast about the area and its residents and what they want. At our latest live taping, I sat down with Ebony Dumas and Anita Cozart from the office to talk about what they're up to. Today is Thursday, July 18th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about.
District Crossroads is a podcast that looks to the future of Washington, D.C., while learning and listening to our current neighbors and dropping in on some stories from the past. And it's brought to you by the D.C. Office of Planning.
All right, so we're going to talk about North Capitol Crossroads, which I have a personal connection to because my dad is buried there. I mean, he died of natural causes. It was not... And this is the subject of the podcast you guys are doing with Bridget. So let me just ask, for people who are not encyclopedic about it, let me just ask the simple question. What neighborhood are we talking about when you say North Capitol Crossroads? It's not on any map.
Right. And so we'll do a quick poll right now. Are there any DC natives in the audience?
Yeah.
Okay, a little bit. How about anyone who's lived here for at least 10 years? Same. All right, so how many people know where North Capitol Street is? All right, now that's what's up. So North Capitol Street is a very important street in D.C. One major reason is it divides northwest from northeast. Additionally, if you kind of look at the length of it, it starts just north of the U.S. Capitol building, which was funny. I had never really realized that was probably part of the reason why it's called North Capitol. But I continue to learn. And so it runs from directly north of the Capitol all the way to the Maryland border. And so when we say North Capitol Crossroads, as Mike said, it's not a stop on the metro. It's not a neighborhood. It is a designated area that the DC Comprehensive Plan identifies. And so think about like North Capitol, Michigan Avenue, Irving Avenue, and where those three streets kind of meet, and then the wider communities around that. And so there's a lot of institutions there, such as the Armed Forces Retirement Home or the Old Soldiers Home, Trinity Washington University, Catholic University, the Basilica, the Washington Hospital Center. And so all of that area is what we're calling the North Capitol Crossroads area. A lot of the iconic landmarks, but also where where DC starts to kind of change from small, short, walkable blocks to these huge, strips of highway infrastructure where some of you might be going a little bit too fast if you're in a car. So yeah, that's the area that we're talking about when we say North Capitol Crossroads.
Let me ask the why question, which is why this is an area that's a focus for you guys. So you're driving north on North Capitol Street, and as you say, you're coming through Cityscape, and here's a nice Washington grid, and then all of a sudden, the road turns into the highway for crossings. It dips down underneath, and there are these service roads. You look to your right, and there's row houses. You look to your left, there's row houses. They're cut off from each other, like by a wall almost. And then you get into these super blocks with nothing. It can be pretty grim in those blocks. Can we just flash back to like 50 or 60 years or however long it's been, the predecessors who were thinking about that? I mean, at some point, somebody thought it was a good idea to do that. And now we're sort of thinking about how to move past that. What was the thinking in the first place?
And I have to say the podcast captures it well, and one of my favorite parts speaks to this. But part of it was real kind of reaction to the city. And in many ways, we recognize this as part of the legacy of professional planning. These ideas that kind of rejection of kind of the mixing of people in cities, the mixing of uses in cities, that somehow that is inherently bad, and the social ills that permeate through decades and centuries are because of that mixing. And so this idea of dividing up these people, dividing up uses, using highway transportation, using single land uses and large institutions and large campuses to really segment people off, that was part of the ideas of the land that we had at that time. And so planners took that on. And again, that's part of our kind of legacy, and the way we think about it today at the Office of Planning is our kind of commitment to racial equity really recognizes that history and recognizes that there's a contribution for planners and planners who work at our office to work in collaboration with community to think about reparative means for that. And that's why we're thinking about the North Capitol Crossroads.
Right, which is where the podcast comes into play. Which is, can you imagine sort of your stereotypical planner of the 60s or 50s? They came out, they looked at these row houses, people on their front porches, and they thought, this is slum. Everyone knows that suburb is the only acceptable way to live. This is slum. We're going to do something about it. I don't imagine they talked to a lot of people. What your project is doing is talking to an awful lot of people about what they think of how they live now, some of which we may be wrong about because we're not in the community.
One of the things I want to underscore, if you think about the planners of that time, I don't think they looked like Ebony or I or had lived experience, even though they were observing communities that were full of people of color. And so I think that is part of it, is really kind of reframing participation as being so important. Before the podcast started, a big part of movements around planning, grassroots movements in planning, were advocacy planning, and then also increasing participation, because this idea that you could be in an office, come visit a place, not talk to anybody about what you saw, and then go back to your office and write policy and write law, was what that there was pushback against that because of the outcomes that happened to people and places as a result of that.
Yeah, and so that was one of the goals of the podcast was, okay, this is a large area. A lot of DC residents experience this area on a daily basis, but not a lot of people live there. And so how can we get that feedback? How can we have more of a human touch to the research that we're doing in this area? And, we started to talk to people who, honestly, one of the historians is here right now, and she knocked on doors just to get an idea of, she went to a couple of graveyards and talked to people who work there. She tried to get in touch with people who drive shuttles in the area, because there's a lot of shuttles in that area. And so one of the goals was to be able to have more people who don't traditionally participate in, regular planning exercises, to have their stories documented, have us understand that lived experience, so it then impacts the rest of the work that we do. But honestly, another goal of doing a podcast was to have fun. I like to have fun at work. And I was very fortunate that Director Cozart allowed me a little bit of freedom to try this new thing for the Office of Planning, in the way that we communicate with people, in the way that we share our work continues to evolve. And this is just one new method that we're trying. But I also think another major goal for the podcast was so people can, understand the work that the DC Office of Planning does and understand our work without having to come to a 6 p.m. Tuesday night meeting once a month to kind of keep up with what's going on. And so those are some of the goals of the podcast. And I think, it highlights a big difference of how planning was done 50 or 60 years ago and how the Office of Planning is approaching it now.
Did you have any favorite stories that jumped out at you from the folks who got interviewed, the people on the podcast?
Yeah, definitely. I learned a lot about that area. If you all don't know, there are a lot of fences in that area. And so it's like these institutions, you kind of maybe drive down Irving Street or North Capitol, and you see the backs of buildings. You see large fences with like a lot of green area and maybe a golf course or maybe a lake back there, but you can't access it. And so we wanted to try to like peel back some of the fences, even, almost like metaphorically. But one piece that I thought was really interesting was this guy, Umair Hassan, who has a house at North Capitol and Michigan Avenue. And I'd always kind of driven by this house or walked by this house and seen this beautifully painted bathtub that is also a bus stop seat. And so he owned the house, and when he would come home, any time of the night or day, there would be people sitting on his steps because there was a bus stop right in front of his house. And so instead of being like, get off my steps or get off my lawn, he was like, how can I make this area more welcoming to anyone, in my community? And so he found a bathtub and cut it in half, hired an artist from Pakistan to come to the United States and paint this bathtub in a traditional Pakistani truck art style. And that was like his gift to the community. So I thought that was a really great example of tactical urbanism where, this is a neighbor who really felt he wanted to be more inclusive and make his neighborhood more welcoming. And that's what he did. And I think we have some clips, right, that we can play.
Suddenly, a simple question from a tired bus rider looking for a place to sit is turning into something bigger.
Just kind of synchronously at the same time, I was in communication and I was messaging a Pakistani truck artist named Haider Ali to just to learn more about the art. And he made the offer that he could come to the U.S. It's like, hey, this could, I'm putting a bench right outside on the street. This could be a great thing to display an old traditional Pakistani folk art that I find really beautiful. He decided to come, and I gave him some money out of the grant, and he painted the bench, and it turned out to be much more interesting than I could have imagined.
And Haider Ali is more than just your average painter. If you lived in the area for a while, you may have seen some of his work before.
He was here in the mid-2000s as part of the Smithsonian Folklife Festival and painted a truck, and that gave him some press, and I believe that's how I found out about him too. He painted a truck on the National Mall.
The painting is exquisite and unlike anything you'll see at any other bus stop in the city.
So he could have been a jerk about it. Get off my lawn.
He could have been a jerk.
Or he could have hassled Metro, move your stop, or put
Right.
up a bus barn or something. But instead, it was this sort of vernacular.
Yeah, and that was actually the first oral history that we collected for this project. 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning, I won't complain, but...
Wait, you knocked on his door at 7 a.m. on Sunday?
We did not knock on his door at 7 a.m., but once we knocked on his door and got to speaking with him, that was the time that he wanted to meet to be recorded. We went to his house, and he gave us peaches from his peach tree in his front yard. And it was a really great experience. And so that was just like the beginning of like, wow, this is going to be a really great project. We have people who are interested in participating and people who are doing great things in their neighborhood.
Can you explain what the seat is like? I'm having a hard time seeing how you turn a bathtub into a seat.
So if you have a clawfoot bathtub and you happen to also have a saw, a power saw, you cut it in half. And so it forms, the basin of the bathtub, when cut in half long ways, forms a seat. And so then he sanded the edges so it wouldn't like cut people's legs and, have a lawsuit on his hands.
There's a hospital close by.
Right. Oh, man. But yeah, that's how the bathtub was created to become a seat, a bench.
Anita, did you have a favorite story?
I did. And it was related to the folks who did organizing against the continuation of I-95 through this neighborhood.
395, if you ever take 395 under the mall and then comes up and ends at New York Avenue. Why does it end there?
Actually, I think about that every time I hit that traffic jam or the highway ends.
It's supposed to extend further north through our neighborhoods.
That's right. That highway was supposed to keep going north from Southwest DC, through Brookland toward College Park, Maryland. The impact of freeways crisscrossing the city, the noise, the smell, the physical obstruction would have had a profound effect on the North Capitol Crossroads area. But what could local residents do?
Before home rule, the Congress wanted to build highways all across the city, in essence, carving it up.
There were protests at the public meetings and a lawsuit. They fought tooth and nail to stop the federal government from paving over their neighborhoods. So back to Robert Molesky's question.
Why does it end there? Because of those protesters. That's where they stopped it. And it took time, but the plan was, in 1971, completely jettisoned. That's where they stopped it. I think that is one of the great stories of Washington, D.C. history. It's one of the few times the city got together and showed that it can have some power, even without representation in Congress, if we all work together on something.
It was interesting to me for lots of different reasons. One, because it's a real kind of education in terms of, advocacy and people power, even in the face of like very long odds. So I think that was a big part of it. And then just it really helps you understand kind of the fabric of the neighborhood and how you have this is the answer to why there's a big cloverleaf shape in the middle of this neighborhood. And it's also a big answer to, what happens when you divide up neighborhoods and you relocate individuals and what happens with that. And then also what it takes, the kind of advocacy work, the coalition building work that it takes to stop those kinds of things. So I think it's also something not just for our history, but for our future. And so lessons for us to learn about kind of coalition building, about things that really matter for the outcomes for people's lives.
Let's be real, lawsuits are not fun, but with Paulson & Nace, at least they're a little easier. Paulson & Nace is a DC law firm in every sense of the word. It was founded here in 1979. Partner Chris Nace is a local who cares deeply about the DC community, even serving on the board of the local branch of the Living Classrooms Foundation in his free time. Nace and his associates Samantha Peters and Maya Perry handle medical malpractice, wrongful death, and other complex injury cases. And they don't just settle every case. They'll go to court. They'll fight for you. Paulson & Nace has even been recognized as one of U.S. News' best law firms. So if you have been hurt or lost a loved one because of someone else's mistake or negligence, call Paulson & Nace for a no-obligation consultation. Visit www.paulsonandnace.com. That's PAULSONANDNACE.com. Or call 202-463-1999.
Let's talk about, the anthropology is really cool, but it is, obviously you guys are using it in service of what to do now. So what is next for this neighborhood?
So I think this history piece is really important because it sets the context for how important it is for people who live, work, play in the area to really think about what contribution they can make. And so one of the big picture things about what's next is that I'll see how many claps we get for this, but in January 2025, we're going to initiate a rewrite of the comprehensive plan for the District of Columbia. That is deeply encouraging. And one of the things that's really important is for neighborhoods like this that were shaped by these 20th century planning decisions to really think differently about what's ahead, right? So medical care is happening very differently now, right? And the needs that we have are very different. Educational institutions are functioning very differently now. And so what does that mean for all of the fences that Ebony talked about earlier? What does that mean for kind of transportation and how people travel along? People want different choices and more choices for how you get from one place to another. It's not just about getting to work. For many people, that is the number one travel that they have to do. For others, that's number 4 or 5, right? And so how do we provide more choices? And then we have to think about issues of climate and resiliency. What are ways that we rethink the way our buildings are shaped, the way neighborhoods are shaped, to really be much more resilient, both in terms of climate, but then also in terms of the economy as well. And then also just thinking about the needs that we have for gathering spaces is very different. I'm like so excited about the new Reservoir Recreation Center that's there at McMillan Reservoir. It's just really interesting because it's set up for such multi-generational use, indoor, outdoor use, all of these things. And it's so important when you think about the future is being recreation forward, being gathering spaces of different kinds forward. And we think that that's a great way. And it's in some ways proven if you think about a neighborhood like Navy Yard that really started very recreation forward. A big picture recreation with a large baseball stadium, but also neighborhood recreation focused in terms of a waterfront park that created access that wasn't available in recent history. And so that's what's next, really thinking about how to embed these values and what they translate into in terms of the neighborhood as part of our comprehensive plan conversations. And wait, there's more.
And so in addition to thinking citywide, what's next, like for this project, we have northcapitalcrossroads.com, and that is where you can follow the evolution of this project. So in addition to collecting oral histories and doing a podcast, there's also the traditional like land use, urban design, research, and vision that was created. And so we're really looking for folks who care about the neighborhood, folks who care about the area, to contribute by going to North Capitol Crossroads. There's a survey there. You can leave your feedback. We want to hear from you, and then once we get that feedback from the survey, and even from our conversations today, maybe we'll be able to refine the vision and then share that out with you. Probably, I think, in the fall, sometime in the fall. In addition, there's also, as Anita mentioned, Reservoir District, and so that recreation center. We are working with the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, that office, to look at opportunities to bring in artists and creatives, who are based here in DC, to really breathe more life into the area that is beautiful. And we want to be able to make sure people are able to continue to activate that space, have it be a place where people want to go. In addition to the recreation center, there's just so much open space. And so how can we work with local artists and creatives to make sure that that space is continually programmed as well?
Yeah, and just I want to add one of the things that we're really thinking about for this area. It fits into the comprehensive plan, but also fits very specifically into what's next for this area, is really thinking about kind of how recreation for development that happens at McMillan that will have residential associated with it, and other kind of retail uses, dining and shopping, how that impacts major institutions like Catholic University, like the hospitals, like Trinity University and others, and even nearby Howard University. This idea of really kind of thinking differently about how those campuses really operate, and thinking about the people who work there, the people who are educated there. What if they're able, just imagine 5 or 10 or 15 years in the future, you double the amount of people who are working at those institutions who are living in and around that neighborhood, right? That they find their way. That gets to their travel choices, the change in amenities that they want, and how do we kind of think about that as a potential home for many of these students as they graduate, many of the faculty, many of the other folks who work in the hospitals, from administrators all the way to physician's assistants.
I think one of the reasons you maybe had some trepidation when you said that about the comprehensive rewrite of the plan, and you alluded to the legacy of planning, is that there's a lot of people who think of planning as an excuse for them, the government or whoever it is you're afraid of, to push things you don't want. And I think that's one of the perverse legacies of this victory DC won over the highways, was that the correct move is whatever they want to plan, we got to stop it. These days, I think a lot of that anxiety attaches to gentrification, and they're getting ready to clear poorer people out and turn this into a sort of playground city for post-collegiate professionals. I'm curious if one, did you hear that in your conversations with neighbors? And two, when you do hear that, what do you do to allay people's concerns?
So, did we hear that during this project? Absolutely. We heard it from some of the land stewards who have farms and community space in the area. We heard from some neighbors who we reached out, like, would you be interested in participating in this oral history podcast thing? And they're like, there are so many concerns that I have that are bigger than creating, telling my story and helping you create a podcast. For me, it was definitely like a point where it's like, that's totally a valid position. And like, I've lived in this city since 2005 and have experienced myself being, pushed out and displaced. And so I always bring that back to the office. And so we can continue to adjust how we communicate with people, how we do our plans, what we're looking at, and understanding that honestly, when we go into an area that we're about to do a plan for, there is going to be a concern. And how do we, produce a recommendation or produce a vision that is asking the tough questions of ourselves and of people who look at it in the future when they are starting to redevelop?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the pieces, whether it's around kind of physical displacement or economic displacement, there's also a piece around cultural displacement, right? A feeling of once you belonged in that community and now you're excluded from that community, isolated from the future of that community. And so part of it, we do think storytelling and oral history is part of it. We also think that there's opportunities to put markers in our public spaces that tell the history, that tell the stories, that capture them so that it's not something, it doesn't feel like it's something that is lost, but rather celebrated, right? So you think about something like mosaics that you see for either Chuck Brown or Marvin Gaye in the Langdon Park or Marvin Gaye Park, and the festivals that happen yearly for each of those wonderful musicians with important roots here in DC. We think about those as ways to really engage people in conversation about this. And then we also think about like what tools we have to actually look at issues of economic displacement and physical displacement, whether they're tools around housing financing or whether they're tools around the way we provide for more intensity of uses along our major corridors in the city, because we know that the more housing that you build, the more supply that's available, the more we can invest in deeper affordability in places where we need it. And certainly the challenge that we face is, one, we face this legacy of planning that we have talked about. And then two, we face this legacy of underinvestment in a lot of neighborhoods, right? And that has had a generational impact, both on the neighborhoods themselves, but individuals who you might knock on their door and that's the response you get. And so we spend time thinking about how we can, as we do our community engagement, how we can be responsive to that and how we can honor people's lived experience.
And also, I like to kind of put a pinpoint on it. What has come out of us doing planning and research and engagement? There are IZ requirements, inclusionary zoning requirements for new developments that happen. And so, for example, in the Reservoir District, there will be, I think, 20% of the units will have a level of affordability. As there's also senior housing that's being built there. And then there's like the Black Home Ownership Task Force, which Director Cozart chaired last year, which looked at opportunities to increase Black home ownership here in DC. And then HPAP, a program that a lot of us have heard of. While it runs out of money pretty quickly, it is there, and there have been people who've been able to utilize it.
It's a tricky thing, right? You guys are in the business of making things nicer, but we're a market society. So when things get nicer, more people want it, and that does something to who can afford it, unless you have access to some other tools.
Yes, it's true. And so one of the things that we talked about a lot as part of the Black Homeownership Strike Force was about kind of preservation. And so this idea of planning for people to be able to stay is like the antithesis, in many ways can be the antithesis of, kind of a market system where there's this idea, move every 7 years or move every, so often to keep things going. But this idea of how do you create some tools that manage your way through that, given the, legacy homes that have been in people's families for a while and the challenges and barriers you face as it relates to estate planning and transferring homes in the family and resources needed for that. And then also for folks who want to stay but may not have, kind of the capital to keep a home up. And this may be a single family home. This could also be, we know this is an issue with condominiums. DC has a lot of condominiums and co-ops, and it's a challenge for many of them. And so trying to explore ways to provide more of those resources, both financial but also technical assistance as well.
I'm curious for both of you. You've both been doing this kind of work for a while. How has this sort of research changed the way you think about your job and your sort of place in the world?
So, I think I think what it has is kind of given voice, literally, to, kind of the interests that I've had and even getting into planning. Like, I started off thinking that I was going to be an environmental engineer, and I was going to focus on the kind of climate issues and engineering solutions to climate issues and all of that kind of thing. And along the way, it just didn't feel right because it didn't feel like I was having enough conversations and writing enough essays about people.
It's like you went from hard scientist to social scientist.
So, yeah. And I have to say, kind of, as we're doing this podcast, it just resonated with me so much. Why? Because McMillan is a sand filtration site. The kind of wastewater treatment plant that if I had stayed as an environmental engineer, I would be, I guess, having to phase out at some point, right? And so, but thinking about the people who are impacted by our major infrastructure, for me, it's kind of a perfect spot to be in. And then the connections that I have to this area, I don't live too far. I live over in Michigan Park. I had my second child at Washington Hospital Center. And now, a month ago, went with my kids over to Reservoir Park. And so having all of these things nearby is really important. But I think that's kind of how this comes full circle for me. How about you, Ebony?
Sure. For me, it's been really fun being a planner and thinking back to how I grew up. And so, I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and there were just, there's a lot of segregation, but also the segregation I saw and understood that, my neighborhood did not have sidewalks. And I go over to some of my friends' house, and there were sidewalks and street plantings and very clear urban design guidelines that were adhered to in other parts of the neighborhood. All the jobs were over there. So I had to get in a car and drive to a different neighborhood to, do my little scoop in the frozen custard. It's my high school job. But so now, as an urban planner, how it's come a little bit full circle, I really understand the importance of a lot of the work that we do, and that it's done across the whole district and not only in upper Northwest. And so the fact that there are, historic preservation regulations and design guidelines for my neighborhood and Anacostia, same way that they are in Chevy Chase, for me, that's been a full circle moment where it's impacted my life and my work has come together.
You mentioned this a little bit before, but just before we stop, I want to put a little bit more on it. What can people in this area, this part of town, or for that matter beyond this part of town, do to have their own influence on this effort?
Sure. And so we do encourage you to first listen to the podcast called District Crossroads. Bridget Todd, who is co-host here at CityCast, was our host for the podcast miniseries.
Give it up for Bridget.
Yes, that's true. An amazing talent, truly amazing talent. And so in this project, we have identified some design opportunities that we think could be transformational for future generations of DC residents. And so we invite you to go to northcapitalcrossroads.com. So remember, North Capital is with the O, not the A. So northcapitalcrossroads.com. I think you have a paper in your seat that has a QR code that takes you there as well. There's a quick survey. I think it's 5 questions. And then if you want to stay updated, with how your feedback impacts the final vision, then be sure to leave your email address so we can build that email list to stay in touch.
Well, listen, everybody, thank you so much for being here. This was so much fun. I hope we get to do it again. and keep us posted on what winds up happening.
All right.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Like we always say at City
You look
Cast, we
so
love
good.
good
Give yourselves a
comprehensive
round
plan.
of applause. All right.
And that is all for today here on CityCast DC. If you want to hear more, sign up to be a member. We've got 20 minutes of Q&A with Anita and Ebony on our members-only feed and a bunch more members-only content. You can sign up for as little as $8 a month at membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.
Why did Ebony get all the claps?
You know why. Anita.
People, give it up for Anita. She will replan your neighborhood into submission.